Our most formidable enemies we do not know by name. They do not make a spectacle of the power they wield. In fact, the vast majority of our fellow men is completely unaware even of their existence. Their purposes are, however, rather simple to understand once you become aware of the nature of our conflict. They are, in all manners, our very opposites. What they want, tempering perhaps with the proverbial wells, is but a means to a way. The way or path is of the left handed variety. The conflict at hand is not material in nature, even though it might appear this way to the untrained eye. It is in fact entirely spiritual. The purpose of what our purely theoretical enemy does is to replace everything foundational to us with the very opposite. This understanding may be applied to any matter that is conceivable to the present man, being in direct opposition with traditional teachings. This effect has not resulted from a natural chaos, but rather from a well organized kind. Uprooting tradition has been the job of our enemies since time immemorial, but progress really began picking up with the so called Renaissance. Unfortunately, there is no time for getting into such ancient history at the present moment. Instead, for the purposes of this video, we will analyze the path of progress. But first, what even is progress? Progress is, for all intents and purposes, the very opposite of tradition. It simply represents an umbrella term for all of the accomplishments of our enemies in replacing what is good, namely virtue, and all that derives from it, with the very opposite, vice and all that derives from that. Righteous authority is replaced by empty tyranny, respect is replaced by fear, admiration by resentment, and love is replaced by lust. The perversion of the most noble of creating powers leads to the creation of the abominable. It is all much simpler than the obfuscating intellectual wants to make it all out to seem. In his view, everything has to be complicated, multifaceted, and diverse. Everybody has their own truth, and one must simply listen to their caprice or their heart in order to fulfill whatever they must fulfill in a world devoid of meaning. But it is also very simple. Everything seems so complicated by design. It is in order to confuse. The truth is there are only two options in anything and everything: the good and the evil. The good derives from God. It is truth, it is beauty, it is life, it is love, it is self sacrifice. It is, with one word, virtue. Everything that originates from our enemies is the very opposite of all that. Their scientific theories, their telling of history, their supremacy over information, all in an attempt to rewrite even the human genome while dimming the sun. It seems absurd, doesn't it? It is all very logical for those who are in all manners the very opposite of what we are. What to us is absurd, to them is a no-brainer. What to us is balanced structures, to them is oppressive. What to us is repulsive, to them is attractive, and so on. It is also very simple. You are given two options. You worship God and follow his laws, or you worship the enemy. Of course, most Europeans would never have willingly chosen to abandon God and change sides, so to speak. So this is where intellectualism comes into play. Now, preceding this word, intellectualism, there would have otherwise been, in open conversation, perhaps another word, describing some matter of belonging. But I must refrain from such on YouTube. The problem with this type of intellectualism did in fact precede our culture, and even our enemy, that is true. Socrates was speaking of sophists long before our spiritual battle achieved its final form of good against evil, that our ancestors understood all too well. Secularization was, in the beginning, the mostly quiet rallying cry, through which our subversive enemies had instilled in our cultural elites, through their characteristic sophisms, the ideas of the so-called Illuminism. The modern state, which is ran by the enemy through its capital, acts as lawgiver in the sake of the Lord, and after centuries of such, progress has reached its final stages. This could have not been achieved without the corruption of our natural elites. Their degeneration, leading to a loss of faith and thus of purpose, opened the door for a new elite to take their place. These were the revolutions from the late 1700s into the early 1900s, with regard to the states that were not already conquered through capital, like Britain, for example. The battle, before being won on the battlefield, it was won in the minds of our greatest, in the midst of the occult. The Christian religion, the right-hand path, could not promise boundless worldly pleasure, and when wealthy foreigners with an affinity for the perverse, for drug use, for sexual promiscuity, began promoting these worldly pleasures among the European aristocracy, many simply gave in. This was a long-term project, to be sure, but we live in the final conclusion of its achievements today. Once the body, mind, and spirit of man have been weakened by decadence, he is left unprotected to the corruption of the enemy. Decadence, which shall not be understood simply as an affliction of the wealthy, stands at the basis of the weakness that prevails over modern men. Almost all in the West today live decadent lives. That does not mean all are rich. Quite the opposite, in fact. Most are much poorer than they realize, as they do not possess any real wealth, like land, gold, silver, or real estate. But they live decadent lives nonetheless, all made possible through debt, being able to buy things that they don't need, that they cannot even afford. Many are used to luxuries that historically were only available to the very wealthy, like not having to cook, not even having to source ingredients, but having your meal delivered to your doorstep by some third worlder. Not having to do anything with your own hands, having everything done for you, is exemplary of the ridiculous levels of decadence that we have reached today. Now, one does not grow their own food, does not take the life of an animal they raised, one does not make their own clothing or build their own home. All essential labor is done through the exploitation of a slave class of non-white origins. There is much historic precedent to look at to understand how dire the situation is. The fall of Rome was a result of many of the same issues that affect our society today, but arguably one of the greatest came as a result of the Edict of Caracalla of 212 AD that granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire to increase the tax base, basically to keep the GDP from shrinking. By modern estimates, before the edict was passed, under 10% of the population were actually citizens, meaning perhaps 5 to 6 million, while after the edict was passed, that increased to 40 to 50 million, a nearly tenfold increase, quite literally overnight. The last nail in the coffin was, however, the Gothic crossing of 376, when upwards of 200,000 Gothic refugees, fleeing the invasion of the Huns, asked to cross the Danube into Roman territory, which the emperor accepted, on the condition they relinquish their weapons, which was unenforceable, and so they didn't, choosing to bribe Roman officials instead. Of course, one can look at more recent history, like in the US, where when you factor in just the material costs, not even considering the much greater social costs, one may easily arrive at the conclusion that it would have been much, much cheaper for Americans to just pick their own cotton. Every day, in seeing what our once great civilization has become, we pay the price for our decadence. And from decadence, when one has all his basic needs met by the slaves, intellectualism is born. Now, what I have been referring to as intellectualism is not simply the art of thinking or the love of wisdom. It is rather the justification coming from convoluted arguments, firstly within one's own consciousness, if they are lucky enough to possess one, of all manners of indulgences and of rebellion, and namely against the teachings and laws of God. In this sense, the intellectual, taken over by the hubris characteristic of the rebel, seeks to justify, firstly to himself, that he is intellectually superior, that he knows what others do not in order to feel special. He attempts to deconstruct all that has been from the beginning of time seen as good. Ironically, I am to some extent guilty of the same practice, but as living in a wholly corrupt world, I deconstruct the progress and try to promote the good. Intellectualism, thus, is dominated by the instinct to justify the unjustifiable. To that end, science is its canon. Approaching a conclusion, we must understand who the intellectual is. Now, more than ever, these are primarily the people that I have referred to in the previous video as midwits. I would describe the peak of midwittery to be around 110 IQ, but the spirit of the midwit might be present in those of both lower and higher intelligence also. Not all who possess this level of intelligence are midwits, and not all who score highly on an IQ test are actually intelligent, while not all who score lower are necessarily dumb. This is where the bell curve may become a useful tool for us in the understanding of the philosophy of the midwit. It is so that people who have grown up as being somewhat more intelligent than their peers, reading progressive materials that go against the traditional teachings that were foundational to our forefathers, as they are much more difficult to be understood, these individuals come to regard those teachings as inferior to those which have been particularly catered to their level of cognitive abilities. Simply put, they are too dumb to understand wisdom. Their parents may have not understood it either, but they mostly knew it was so for a reason, so they did not rebel. These blind, deaf, and fragile intellectuals readily embrace the sophisms of the enemy, as that is what feeds their egos, and these sophisms are crafted specifically with that purpose in mind. The midwit is smart enough to understand what the propaganda wants him to understand, but not smart enough to understand it is propaganda. He is not dumb enough to not question the orthodoxy, to accept it as a complete mystery, but he is certainly dumb enough to not understand its deeper meanings, while being so arrogant to refuse to even try to understand its more simple teachings. In this way, the average Joe, while technically not more intelligent than the midwit, tends to be a lot humbler, and as a result, much wiser, not thinking himself greater than he is. As a result, the average Joe, and people of even lower intelligence, tend to be less prone to internalize the propaganda, as they generally accept the view that tradition was and still is the way to at least live a good life. On the other hand, there are those who are actually intelligent, and if they are lucky enough to eventually be given wisdom through the grace of God, they might, at least in small part, understand the immense depth of positive knowledge found in the orthodoxy. The most important elements to understanding is that not intelligence, but humbleness, as being the only way one, regardless of their intelligence, may achieve wisdom. Hubris is central to the philosophy of the midwit. While rebellion represents the driving force of his existence, his questioning is never deep, but surface level enough that he can think himself in his shallow mind to always be in the right. The frame of mind of the modern intellectual is dominated by fallacies, the biggest of which, central to his identity, being the appeal to authority. In the mind of the man blessed with at least some amount of wisdom, the only appeal to authority is to that of God, but in the sick mind of the intellectual, that appeal is to secular authority, namely the state, media, and so-called experts, that to the ignorant appear independent, but here on this channel we very well know that is not in the least so. The midwit is a pious member of the Church of Atheism. His prophets are men like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye. His canon is the established science, which after 2020 we all very well know how often it changes, which he tries to proselytize to those wiser than him. The midwit is also dominated by self-righteousness. He does not just think himself empirically right at all times, but his morality is also superior. His morality is characterized by a lack of morality, a lack of fundamental laws. He argues that there is no need for God in the judiciary, instead that all law is simply arbitrary. He is a moral relativist. To him murder is wrong, but only when it suits his argument. It is wrong because, in his view, it is an infringement on the rights of an individual. But of course, the midwit is not known for having a backbone or consistency of any kind, as by his own admission, his rules are wholly arbitrary. Not ending the life of an unborn child may just as well be an infringement on the rights of an individual. This is a perfect example of intellectualism, always justifying the unjustifiable as a result of not having clear laws that come from beyond the realm of man. In the end, it may be said that the most notable characteristic of the intellectual is his arrogance. He is a product of decadence. His existence is only guaranteed by living in a society in which incompetence and the ability to blindly follow the whims of a corrupt elite represent the highest form of social currency. He is allowed to thrive as he is, for all intents and purposes, an enforcer of the new orthodoxy, that bearing the mark of the beast. The intellectual is both a rebel and a useful idiot. He is a midwit. He is a blind servant of the enemy, a fool, a coward, and a traitor, and his existence is entirely dependent on the continuation of progress, as a return to tradition, to the promotion of positive values, would mean the end to all his privileges that derive from modern collectivism, and as a result of his incompetence, as not being able to survive, let alone thrive on his own, a return of the West to God may very well mean the end of his existence.